Good morning, good day, and good evening. I'm as always your host, Brody Robertson, and today we have a guest that I had meant to contact a long time ago, back when you were first starting your channel, and then I forgot to do so. But you're here now. Welcome to the show, Michael Horn.
Hi. Hi.
Perfect introduction. For anyone who doesn't know who you are, just brief introduction, what do you do, who you are, all that sort of stuff.
Okay. So I am a YouTuber, as some of you might have guessed. I work, my full-day job is actually a system administrator, mainly, unfortunately, in the area of Windows servers, but increasingly Linux as well. Yeah, I like Linux, desktop environments, all that stuff. It's exciting. I like it.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Well, I guess the best place to start is just, how did you first find yourself using Linux? Like, I know you've documented the, like, you switching to Linux on your channel. Was that the first time you'd actually swapped, or had you used it in the past before? Or, like, just how long have you been aware of Linux?
That is actually a question that I cannot answer.
Okay.
Because how long was I aware? It's funny. So I got reintroduced to Linux during my study program in like Linux server administration. And I was like, yeah, I already have heard of it, but I don't actually know where. And I've also used it at some point, I guess. Like I used some commands. It's very weird. I have no idea where I knew it from, but it was basically around, I think it was in 2020, something around that area, that I was basically moving more towards Linux. And at this point, my old gaming laptop broke, and so I just pulled out an old one. It had Windows on it. I couldn't update it anymore. It was unsupported. And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to install Debian on it. I'm just going to throw KDE Plasma on it. It was my first experience. And it worked surprisingly well. That was in January, I think. And shortly after, like 2 months after, I made my first video on Linux.
Okay. Why Debian? Was it just something you happened to know about at the time, or was there another reason for it?
Yeah, basically that. So it was Debian 11, I think.
Okay.
If it was already out, or 10, I'm not sure. But I knew it already. And since I'm a bit more technical in general, I don't mind installing an operating system with like custom partitioning and everything. You don't have to, but I did it anyway. And it's a fun installer if you know what you're doing. So that's the main reason why.
Okay. Because a lot of people, they will have like got a recommendation from a friend or like something like that. Because by the sounds of it, you already have like a fairly established tech background by that point.
Yeah, I guess that a lot of people are just, what should I use? And do you know what's good? But the question is always, what is a good distro? There are so many of them.
Yeah. Well, well, I've got like interesting thoughts on the whole like distro thing. I honestly, I feel like a lot of the distros out there really don't actually serve a purpose in existing. Like, it's cool, people want to make a thing. Like, that's great. Like, go ahead and make your thing. But I really don't think most distros should be recommended to someone, especially if they're new. I think if you're like a new user, the best suggestion is go with something mainstream. Go with an Ubuntu, go with Fedora, Debian, basically anything that has an established community around it, because once you know what you're doing, and you know that you're running KDE, and you know how apt works, and you know all of these other little components are, it's very easy to go and find the specific resources for that individual component. But if you don't even know what KDE is, and let's say I put you on some like random, I don't know, some distro that has like 100 users, finding any sort of resources about the distro will be basically impossible. But if I were to put you on something like Fedora KDE or Kubuntu, even if you don't know what KDE is, if you were to search Kubuntu how to do something, Fedora KDE how to do something, you're far more likely to find resources that at least lead you in the right direction.
Yeah, I I'm 100% there with you. The main problem with what I see online is like, choose that desktop environment if you're a Windows user. But the problem is people coming from Windows don't even know what a desktop environment actually is.
Right.
So telling them you want to switch to Linux, then you gotta pick a distribution, you gotta pick a desktop environment. What do you actually want? Do you want to game? Do you want to work? Blah, 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 blah. The whole point is they want something that works. And like that's basically it. And for a starter, I 100% agree. Like, just pick a mainstream one. Like, honestly, it doesn't really matter if it's backed by a company or not. It doesn't matter if it's a Canonical, if it's a Red Hat or IBM. For a start, just to get into it, just to learn about the operating system, or the kernel and the operating system and how everything is built up, it's a really good idea to just start out with something that most likely works, and then you can always switch afterwards, which a lot of people do once they start getting into it anyway.
Yeah. I am one of the rare people who just really don't like distro hopping. I've been on Arch since I started Linux. I've installed Arch a couple of times because I had some problems that I need to like do a reinstall for, but I have never been one for distro hopping. Like, when I first started using Linux, I didn't just jump right into it. Like, you hear like swapping to Linux, jumping right into Arch. Like, why would you do that? But by that point, I'd already probably watched like 3 or 6 months worth of like YouTube videos, reading information about how to use Linux. Like, even though I hadn't used it myself, I basically had already immersed myself in that experience. And for me, it wasn't just suddenly jumping in, but I know the way that I approached it is not the way that most people approach it. Like, most people, you'll hear someone saying, oh, Windows 7, Windows 8, Windows 10, the support period is over. I don't want to use the next version, whatever happens to be at the time. I'm going to try out Linux. And those are the people who tend to just jump right in. And those are the people who I feel like it's best to direct them to something that at least has a community around it, whether it's the best thing out there. Like, you can have arguments, should a new user be on Ubuntu or be on Fedora? Oh, Fedora, they like to move really fast with things, whereas Ubuntu is a lot more conservative with changes. Yeah, all of that stuff's great, but yeah, I think you're right there. Getting your foot in the door and experiencing it, and then working out what you want from your system from there is a lot easier than just giving all of this choice to a user who doesn't even know what things they should be caring about in the first place.
Yeah. And I think in the first place, like, if you're coming from Windows, then many suggest that you should use something like a KDE Plasma, something like a Cinnamon. But I'm not really sure if that's the right approach, because like, preferences are interesting and Windows forces you into a certain direction, which is kind of nice. Like, if you get into KDE Plasma, so it's similar, but it's not the same.
Yeah, I actually do want to sort of focus on that point, because a lot of people will talk about, if someone's coming from Windows, you want to put them onto a environment that is Windows-like, Cinnamon, like KDE. I know the KDE people very much disagree that they're Windows-like, but frankly, they're Windows-like. Whereas Gnome is a very different kind of way to interact with your system. What do you think of this idea of, you want people to be on something familiar, or would you rather put them on something completely different so they don't fall into the pitfall of thinking it's exactly like Windows and realizing very quickly that even though it kind of looks like Windows, a lot of the functionality they expect from Windows is just not there, or if it is there, it's in a very different location?
Yeah. That's actually a pretty tough one, because like, I know that if you put them into a familiar environment, that they might feel more comfortable. But KDE Plasma is not Windows, and the first time I started noticing that, like, right away, is that you cannot dynamically dock Windows with the meta and the arrow keys. Or I think, no, you cannot. Oh, you can't do that. You cannot maximize it.
Right. Okay.
You can't maximize it. And that was the first thing that I noticed right away. And even though Gnome is a lot different in its overall user interface, it's not that different from a Windows, because, okay, you have a panel at the top and not at the bottom, but the rest is pretty much identical. Like you click in the left upper.
Well, unless it's
like an
Ubuntu
icon
and then you have
activity.
the side
Yeah,
sidebar.
exactly. Yeah. But it's a bit different. But you have all the hotkeys there that you would usually know, even some advanced ones like the old space where it brings up like the maximize, minimize stuff. It's very mixed. Like KDE Plasma has some elements. You have the panel, let's call it taskbar, whatever. You have similar settings. On the other hand, you have Gnome, which has all of the hotkeys, and I gotta say a fuller experience, since on KDE Plasma not everything is as tight in the desktop environment, like calendars and stuff like that. It's very mixed, and I find it hard to recommend desktop environments to newcomers, which is why I usually like pick a GNOME version which has been heavily modified towards Windows or KDE or something like that, because then you have basically all of it in one place and you can always switch afterwards.
Yeah,
but it doesn't really matter in the end.
Yeah, no, that's definitely understandable. You're right. In the end, it really doesn't matter because, like, sure, even if you decide that whatever desktop environment you start on is, you know, the desktop environment for you, like, it's something that you need to decide for yourself ultimately. Like, I am a big fan of tiling, and I will talk about how tiling is the better workflow until the end of time. I don't care that people disagree with me. That's fine. They're wrong. But this is something that you need to experience for yourself and work out what suits your workflow. And are you happy with a Windows-like workflow? Was the way of interacting with Windows a problem you had? Like, how would I say it? Like, if you're on Windows, there's only one way to really interact with it. Every window is going to operate in the Windows-like way. But when you come to Linux, there are options, and you might be happy with what's familiar, but it's only something that you can answer for yourself. Because we can talk about, with like tiling, for example, the power of having a really keyboard-driven workflow, but I can tell you how great that might be. But if you've never used it, it doesn't matter how great it might be on paper. It's something that you still need to learn. Or like, actually a great example of this is moving away from desktops. People who are really big fans of like Emacs and Vim, if you listen to them explain how powerful these tools are when you've had like 5 or 10 years using them, you think this is the greatest thing that you've ever used. And then you try it and you're like, I don't understand how to do anything. I don't understand why anyone think this is good. But it's something that you need to experience for yourself. And I think not just try it out for like a day, try it out for like a couple of days. I think actually immerse yourself in the environment. Give yourself a couple of weeks, a couple of months even, depending on what you want to do. If you have a secondary machine, you know, clean install hardware. Don't even do virtual machine. Just go straight on hardware, where obviously that's not viable for everyone, and dual booting can be a problem, and I wouldn't recommend dual booting to someone who doesn't know what they're doing anyway, unless you do the way I dual boot, which is unplug all of your drives and then install on the drive and then swap them in the BIOS, which is the safest way to do it. But my point of all of this is you need to try it out for yourself and work out what you want from it.
Yeah. Preferences are always hard. Like, nowadays, I don't even like Windows anymore the Windows way.
Yeah.
Not because like it's very unusual or something, but there's just some functionality that I now use that just isn't there.
Right.
One example, like something like an overview, which I use or I really like, because I always have one hand on my mouse. Simply because I do a lot of editing, I do some, basically with GIMP, photo manipulation and all that stuff. So being able to trigger that stuff with my mouse is pretty cool. Windows does also have the functionality in some way. You have like the Windows tab key, but you cannot pull Windows from one screen to another, or at least not in Windows 10. And that throws me off so much. Like, I tried it every single day when I'm using Windows, and it just doesn't work. And then I'm like, okay, it doesn't work. And all those things, live improvements, switching between desktops, it's just not as good. And I've learned that over the years, that this is what I actually prefer. It's not something that when I was coming from Windows, I was first installing KDE Plasma, and I had it exactly in the way that Windows was. But then I tried out other things, and they worked better, even though they were pretty unusual at first.
So when did you... Right now you're using Gnome, yes?
No. Hold on. I think it's 6 weeks for now. It's KDE Plasma 6.
Okay. But you were using Gnome before that?
I was using Gnome, yeah.
Okay.
In the last year, I switched between the two quite often.
Right, that's fair. I guess if you want to have a... It's something I probably should do more. Because I had been using pretty much only tilers since I started, and I think it gives me a good understanding how tilers work, but with the release of Plasma 6, it made me want to try out like what most other people on Linux are using. Obviously, there's also a lot of people on Gnome. I've not actively used Gnome, so I don't really have a proper opinion on that. But, KDE is easily the second biggest desktop. Like, there's no question about that. There's nothing else that's even close to it. I think Cinnamon... I know Nick from the Linux Experiment did like a big survey. I think Cinnamon or something was third place. And that would make sense. It was either Cinnamon or Hyperland. I don't remember. But also, when you're in like a YouTube audience, you're going to be skewed towards very technical people because they're watching YouTube videos. So they're more technical than just the average person. And maybe not more technical, but yeah, actually, that's maybe not the best description. They're more interested in their system, right? Because if you're some, random developer, and you're just using Linux and you're developing software and you're not watching YouTube videos, you just, you use Linux because that's the thing you use on your computer. You probably don't care about your desktop environment as much. Like, I've spoken to some game devs who like do all their stuff in Godot, and as long as they have Godot, the rest of the system literally does not matter. And so maybe a YouTube audience does skew that a bit. But yeah, I really wanted to experience what KDE was like, and I've generally enjoyed it. I don't... It's not the workflow I'm gonna stick with. Absolutely not. I really like my tiling. But I get it, right? Like, I get why people like KDE. It has a lot of customization. I think maybe customization to a fault. And the devs, in a way, do agree with that. And with 6, they've removed some of the options that existed for the sake of having options. Like, things where, yeah, you can customize it, but you probably shouldn't. So they sort of collapse those down into a, like, this is just how it works now. But what is your general thoughts on 6-bin? I know you had experience with KDE 5 as well, so I didn't. What's like the change? How much of a change was it like for you?
So the switch from 5 to 6 wasn't as big as I thought it would be, even though I was complaining a bit on the settings. And I'm not sure if it's just me, but I think they are worse than before. But
okay.
The categories have gotten better, but like the whole how it's ordered, it's a bit weird. Despite that, I didn't really encounter any issues. I did have some issues on 5, but that was a long time ago. Right. Whereas, like, if you had a second monitor in like its vertical, like they had a vertical.
Yeah, I have a vertical.
And
yeah,
if you used Wayland or Xorg for some reason, what it did was it basically expanded my horizontal monitor out of view so that it matched the height of my vertical one. Okay. Which was kind of weird because essentially you just had one big screen with parts of it outside, which made maximizing Windows kind of weird. I'm not sure if that was a one-time thing or not, but it happened at a time. I don't know why, what could have caused this, but that was the only thing I really encountered. Other than that, I think that KDE Plasma does show almost too much in terms of settings because like a lot of stuff is not really in place. One example of this would be tearing support for gaming. the option is there, but if you don't know that, you have to enable it via a variable, because like the atomic mode setting, I think it's called.
Oh, you need to enable a variable for it? What?
Yeah. I think it's in the official merge request still of the tearing thing. KMS atomic or something.
How to enable tearing... Wait, how to enable tearing / disable vsync on KDE Wayland. Hold up. Oh, God. Yeah. So, yeah, you've got to include kwin drm no AMS equals 1 in your Etsy environment. I see. And
that was part of the reason, because for one, the kernel didn't support it yet. Like 6.8 does, but before it didn't. And now it also needs a merge request for 6.1, I think, which fixes some stuff. So that setting is there, but it doesn't do anything.
Right, and a lot of distros aren't... I guess Fedora probably has 6.8, but there probably is a distro... Well, yeah, this person 3 months ago, at the time, there were distros that weren't shipping 6.8 that had Plasma 6. So, yeah, I think that we can chalk that up to the environment that a lot of devs are testing KDE in. They're testing it in things like Neon, and they're testing on things like Fedora, where, you know, it's not stretching the range of how things are being tested. And I think this is a big problem what we're going to see with Kubuntu. Because Kubuntu is going to be shipping 5.27, but they're going to be I think Plasma 6 is going to be in universe, if I'm not mistaken. Someone is going to correct me on that if I am. But I think that things like this, I get how they get missed, but when they're discovered, I do think that something should be added into Plasma, whether it be like, hey, a little tooltip or a pop-up that's like, hey, stupid, enable the thing. But I don't know, it's one of those things where you can chalk it up to the distro. And I've spoken to devs before about this, and they're not really sure where they should say the distro is at fault and where they should implement changes on their side that sort of alleviate issues with the distro. It's a tough problem to deal with. I honestly don't envy that position. I do not want it to be in it for sure. I don't know. It's that's stupid that you use enable variable for it, but I get why it was like that.
Yeah. A lot of people have problems. Like where's the desktop environment default and where is the distribution responsible? I think especially experimental features, like let's take Gnome for example, and fractional scaling. Like a distro could enable it by default. So the Gnome team doesn't really, or might not feel responsible for fixing it right away, because it could be enabled by distribution. It's where does it end?
I think maybe you can make the argument that if it's compiled, you can hide these options behind a compile flag. Like, that's a fairly easy thing to do. So instead of it being an experimental feature you enable, it's an experimental feature the distro has to explicitly compile in. But I guess if it is behind a experimental feature toggle, it's still effectively in a similar state. And if users are enabling it themselves, and users want to report features on it, I think that's great. But this was a similar issue that the OBS Snap had. This is a random tangent. It seems like a random tangent, but it's going to make sense. So the OBS Snap, it ships like 20 different plugins, but because it's being shipped in the Snap, and they're not like additional things you download, if you don't know about the what is and is not a plugin, you're going to see all of these additional things that look like they are core features that should be expected to work. But you might try out one of these plugins, it turns out it doesn't work under like weird conditions, and you go to report it to the developer, and they're like, hey, not our problem. this is a plugin. And it's similar in this way, where it's like, this is an experimental feature. Why is your distro enabling this? Like, we know it doesn't work. That's why it's not enabled. Like, again, I do not want to be in that position myself. Especially when you are at the size of Gnome, and there's going to be a lot of people that, when a distro releases with a new update that enables that, there's going to be a lot of people all at once that'll flood you with the exact same problem.
Yeah. I guess those big desktop environments have really gotten to a point where you really need some sort of management behind them.
Yeah.
Which or automatically comes with a sort of corporate sense, because then you have rules and all that. It's interesting to watch.
Right.
But if you're someone who has to make those decisions, yeah, you are probably going to meet people that don't like it. For the better or the worst. There are some things that are good, there are some things that are bad, and yeah.
So when looking at GNOME and KDE, how do you feel about the idea of GNOME is this environment where it's a lot more curated of an experience? Obviously, they do expose some settings, but the idea is there is the GNOME way of using your system, whereas KDE, it does expose a lot more settings, and you can really do some crazy things with it. If you were recommending this to someone who they had experience, like, maybe with a Linux server, like, they understood all the general surrounding stuff with Linux, they don't need to learn the terminal, but if you were recommending an environment to someone, which direction would you go?
Generally speaking, I would probably go for GNOME for most, simply because it's not too overwhelming. I often like to compare this with Windows. Like, you have the control panel, the old one, which is good. Then you have the new settings, which are objectively worse. But I know a lot of people who like the new settings more, because they cannot find stuff in the control panel anymore. And I like to compare it with this. So the Gnomes, or they try to be minimalistic, very simple, don't expose too much. I think that the average person will have a much better time navigating through that, even despite the overall UX, than in KDE Plasma, because if they need to change something, then finding that setting is a bit more tedious. But it's also not all that bad.
Yeah, I felt a fairly similar way with the control panel. I, grew up using Windows. I've been using it. I think my first system, like, we got a computer fairly late. I think my first home computer was Vista. Yeah, I'd used earlier. My school had earlier than that, but my first home computer was Vista. And I obviously got used to finding things in the control panel. And, I knew everything was, every little setting that I wanted to get to. And it's very much the same with, like, KDE users, where if you've been using KDE for 10 years, you have actually KDE 5 for 10 years, considering how long that one was around for. You have a very good understanding of where everything is. But there is something to be said about that fairly simplified approach, where it doesn't give you as much power, but it does give you easy access to the things that you're going to want to find. Like, everybody is going to want to do their monitor settings or mouse settings or things like this. And instead of it being, like, in the KDE system settings, there's, things like the KWin scripts, and there's an option for, X11 legacy app support is an option there. It's its own separate screen, so it adds to the whole list of settings that are in there. And that's great. Like, it makes it easy to configure stuff. Or makes it, I guess, accessible to configure stuff. But it's not for me, but I get why someone would be more attracted to the simple way of doing it. And there's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. There are two very different approaches to do it, and I think depending on what you're trying to get from your system, they're both completely valid ways of designing a desktop.
Yeah. I'm trying to think about this. There's KDE Plasma and Gnome have two very different approaches in this, and it's really interesting because there is not really a right way to do it. Because if there was a right way, then we wouldn't have different directions.
Sure.
And I guess it depends on just what the average person really wants and expects from the systems. There are many who customize even Windows to a certain extent, which is interesting because you can do it with external tools and whatnot, or even with internal tools with the Power Toys or what it's called.
Well, even just like a system like Auto Hotkey, there are people that have these wild Auto Hotkey scripts to automate massive parts of their system, and that's not something you generally associate with Windows. But if you dig into that more power user approach, like there is tooling there. Obviously, there are things that are locked down, like you're not getting rid of that desktop. The desktop that is Windows can be modified to an extent, but you're not fundamentally changing dwm.exe to anything else. It's gonna be that. And there are other core parts of the system that can't be touched either. But I'm always surprised by what can be done on Windows if you are willing to just dive deep into whatever that system has going on.
And this is like something that I really like on KDE Plasma, because you have most of the stuff there. You just need to find it. Whereas on Gnome, you basically have to first enable it if it's there. If it's not there, then yeah, good luck. So I just technically you can compile some stuff, or you just do it with some different settings. Like they are usually there in some config file in the kernel or whatever file. Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on like running plugins with your desktops? Do you actually use any plugins? Do you use these desktops in a fairly vanilla way? Like what's your general approach?
I usually keep them as minimalistic as possible, but the reason for that is not necessarily because I don't want to use plugins, but because of the YouTube videos. I like for people to see something that looks as close as possible to the native experience, so that they don't install it and it looks completely different. And they're like, but how did you do this? How you did that? And that's sort of the reason. Currently on KDE Plasma, I basically just have one theme installed that changes the colors. And that's it. Like I don't use any KWin scripts. I don't use any icon themes. It's basically a bare bones experience, which is what I like to show others, even though there are things that I would like to improve very much.
What about the I'm assuming the same can be said for the GNOME side then. What about like so besides like the plugins that are just pre-installed, if you did something on Ubuntu, for example, you would just that's if you did an Ubuntu video, obviously you would have the big list of Ubuntu plugins you have installed, but the focus there wouldn't be GNOME in a sense. It would be more like what Ubuntu is doing with GNOME.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, exactly. Like I mean, Ubuntu is technically already just GNOME with a lot of custom plugins, and for me, it's like its own thing. Like GNOME and Ubuntu is not really GNOME for me in the sense that I would like to experience it, even though it's a bit similar. So what I usually do for a native default install is just throw some aesthetics in there, like blur the shell and add tray icons. And for the most part, that's already it. Some people like, of course, having a taskbar, a dock, or whatever. That's pure personal preference. And I wish that was actually an integrated way, because I don't see why they couldn't hide it, or even if they want to keep their clean desktop. It's essentially a bare bones experience, and I like keeping it that way. Like on Ubuntu, I don't really think people have to modify much there, because I think you can change the way how the sidebar or whatever it's called is displayed. yeah, it's almost a. I don't like calling it a modified or better version, because it's essentially just a different experience, a different approach.
Yeah, it's in a sense similar to like what Pop! OS was doing with Gnome, where yes, Gnome is there at its core, but they even called it something different. They called it Cosmic, and now they're working on their actual Cosmic environment, which is very much inspired by what they were previously doing. Even they didn't yes, at its core, and you could install additional GNOME plugins, but that's not what they were intending for that experience.
Yeah.
So, what is your general go-to distro then, if you're using a fairly clean desktop?
It depends on if there are any new releases. So, generally speaking, if a new desktop environment or something releases, then I typically have Fedora installed. Otherwise, I usually am on Debian. Last time it wasn't Debian stable because it wasn't that old. Currently, I would go to a testing branch as soon as 6 or 46 releases.
How old is the latest Debian release right now? How late are we in the cycle? Okay, so 12. When did 12 come out?
I think it was last June or May or something. It's not that old.
That sounds right. Debian 12 release date June 2023. So not old in Debian terms, but still, still a little old. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was GNOME 43 or something. No, it wasn't 44. It was GNOME 43, definitely, which had some problems, especially like file picker icons and stuff like that. And but KDE Plasma was.
I always forget that one took so long to get fixed.
That is insane.
I think it was like.
Oh yeah, KDE Plasma was recent.
I think it was like 10 years or something. It was some ridiculous amount of time. I love finding these issues that, like, people have. It's not like it's an unreported issue for 10 years. It'll be, there's, in some cases, even an open merge request where at the time there was working code for it, but nobody wanted to merge it, and then it just sat there. And over the years, no one else wanted to touch it. And it's always funny to go back and read through those logs, because the problems that people are talking about back then, whilst the specifics, like the specific tech they're using, might change. Like, I read about an issue with the way virtual desktops work on KDE. This issue's been open since the KDE 3 days. So people were talking about using like KDE 3 and GNOME, I don't know, 20 or 15 or whatever it was at the time. Some old version, I don't know what year it was. And even, they'll talk about like internet speeds in the context of like 2003 speeds. And even though you have that context there, the specific way they're communicating about Linux and the problems they're having are exactly the same as what we're seeing today. My favorite one in this regard is, if you go back and read the mailing list from the early 90s, with people arguing about whether it's called Linux or GNU Linux, literally nothing has changed. People are saying the exact same arguments for the past 30 years. And it's always fun to just know that you're not that different from the people that came before you.
Correcting others online. That's always a fun strategy.
It's always a very productive use of your time.
Why? I don't really know. I mean, there are some things that are important that are being correctly said, but then there's others like everyone knows, like no one cares what it's written about. Or like,
is it GNOME or Gnome? Every time I say it, I don't know what changed, because when I first started using Linux, everyone's corrected me when I was saying GNOME. And at some point, there was a switch. And now people are like, why are you saying GNOME? It's a gnome. Like, I don't know if it's... I don't know what to blame. Is it the Steam Deck causing people to try out Linux? Is there's clearly a lot of people using Linux now who don't have this historical context, who are fairly new Linux users, who, and that's fine, right? But it's very weird to see this change happen, because I haven't been using Linux that long. Probably a little bit longer than when. I think I started the year before COVID, whatever year, like 2018 then, I guess? Something like that.
It depends. 19 or...
Yeah,
18 is almost a bit early.
Yeah, 18, 19, something like that. It's only been like 5-6 years. But even then, there's just this very subtle change that's happened, and maybe if I wasn't doing the videos, it's not something I would notice as quickly, but having all of these comments there, you get a very... You definitely get a sense of what people are talking about, and I don't know, it's just a neat little idea that I was thinking of.
Yeah, it might also be just the algorithm, that you're reaching different people with your videos now.
Maybe.
That's something that I discovered over the 2 years that I'm now on YouTube. So at first, there were like a lot of people that said KDE Plasma is better, KDE Plasma is better, and all that stuff. And now it's kind of switching in the opposite side, where a lot of people on the KDE Plasma videos are actually saying, like, no, Gnome is just better. Where it actually balances out. And it's really interesting that when you make a KDE Plasma video, a lot of Gnome users watch it, and then you make a Gnome video, and then a lot of KDE Plasma users watch it. It's really, really interesting to see. And I don't think that the overall audience really changed in the past 2 years. Sure, there was growth, but not in the sense that I would probably notice it. Really interesting.
So, yeah, I guess that's fair. I don't... Maybe it's just a difference in audience, because whenever I do KDE videos, it is a lot of people who use KDE who... Maybe it's because of the way I initially approached it. A lot of people who use KDE who are looking for any slight mistake I make and want to, like, jump on that. I don't know. It could very well just be a difference in audience there. And maybe if this thing with Gnome, people call it Gnome or Gnome, maybe it's just because the channel is bigger, there's a more wider audience, so there's less of the people that are very hardcore into Linux and more of just like general Linux audience. Because when I started my channel, I was doing some of my like big early videos were Vim plugin videos. Vim plugin videos, configuring tiling window managers, and fairly, you have to be obsessed with Linux to want to even talk about this. So the people who are watching it are kind of in that same camp. Whereas now I do a lot more... I feel like I do a lot more videos that are more generally appealing to Linux space. So it is going to get a more general audience from it. And I'm sure you've probably seen that from like some of your videos, because you've had some videos massively... Okay, ignoring the OBS videos, some videos that massively popped off. Oh, I thought you were gonna say something.
Yeah, no, I'm thinking.
Okay.
So, I guess though the videos that mostly popped off are in a certain space sometimes. I think a lot of it was gaming relevant. So you know that you're automatically getting gamers, but not necessarily just from Linux, even though that was the vast majority. So the overall topics, which are much more towards certain applications or just talking videos, usually get a lot less attention, and a lot less technical people are commenting. On gaming, it's like the almost exact opposite. Like when I said Linux has good controller support, there are a lot of comments that just have controller support, that have controller problems. Even though I can't replicate it, and those people are not commenting on other videos which maybe even feature the same topic, which is really interesting. So it really shows that gaming videos, even though they have the same content and they're tagged the same, are being shown to different audiences.
Every time I think I understand how YouTube works, I upload a video where I'm like, this video is going to do well, and then it doesn't.
Yeah. Same, yeah.
Like, I feel like I have a general enough idea down where, for the most part, things are going to do well, and the channel is doing well. But if I was to say that I knew what I was doing, and I knew which videos were going to pop off, that would be a lie. That would be a giant lie.
No, it's really hard to tell. But what sometimes happens is when you make a truly technical video, which like doesn't pop off at all. I think I made a virtualization video about once, Proxmox. That didn't really get much views at first, but it grows steadily, which other videos don't. Like other videos just drop to a basically zero discoverability state, whereas the Proxmox video, it stays up and it gains views over time, which is also a really interesting way. And reading through some of the comments, what problems others have is really interesting. And a lot of things are just different, it seems, from the experience. But it could also be just different versions of a product or something. I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, some of my early... I'm looking at my views right now. Some of my early videos that popped off, there were definitely ones where I jumped onto like a big topic at the time. Like I talked about when LTT recommended Atlas OS and they just completely ignored a lot of security stuff with it. I did a video on this is actually a fairly recent video, on the Linux kernel GitHub. And if you go to the issue tracker, it is some of the... Because they don't check it. It just has insane issues there that don't make any sense. But my first video over 100k was a video on how to do multi-monitors on X11. It hit like 120,000. It wasn't a good video. It was rambly as hell. It didn't do well when I first uploaded it. But it's one of those videos where... Let's see, is it... Yeah, even today, it's still getting a couple hundred views. And... Jeez, the average watch duration is 2 minutes on. Yeah, that was not a good video. That was not a good video. But I'm looking at the graph, and within the first 100 days, it got 800 views. But now it's at 120,000. It's one of those... It's one of those videos where, even though initially it didn't do well, it definitely, you know, when it's a tutorial, it's going to, if people are looking for it, pick up views over the years.
Yeah.
Assuming you don't have, like, massive competition in that space. Like, if you want to make a video on, I don't know, some video game that's popular, that might be different. But when it's something like Linux, where there's a big audience, but there's not that many people making videos on Linux.
Yeah, definitely. I think that Linux content in general has has very big potential to actually grow, because like you can try to make like some product review or something. No one's going to watch that because like you're not really an established brand, not really a trustworthy person, because like you don't have nothing to show for yourself. But on Linux, it's a bit different because everything is like done on the computer, which is pretty easy to show, pretty easy to replicate. Not everything, but it's very similar in comparison. And a surprisingly big number of people are actually using Linux, which I never really thought. One example for this is like I use DaVinci Resolve for editing. I thought I was in the minority here because it's a terrible program on Linux if you set it up on a distribution that is not meant for it.
Yeah.
And a lot of people want or are using it, which is really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I never thought that I would see them at all.
Well, one of the things that always interests me with Linux is my audience is very much the open source, free software crowd. The people who are very interested in, like, the licenses around the software they're using. But there are a lot of people out there, like the gaming audience, like people who use something like DaVinci, who just don't actually care about any of the like build up stuff around Linux, any of the what do you call it, the like politics of licenses or anything like that. They're just here to use good software. And it's always interesting to see the differences between channels, because as I said, mine's very much the free software crowd, but I'll go to someone like I guess even your channel, there'll be a lot more people, because you have done these videos on things like DaVinci, and various other people have done these videos where those people actually do exist as well. And it's easy to forget they do exist, because I think the open source crowd, the free software crowd, are kind of the louder people in this space. Whereas the people who are just using software because it's software they want to use, they're too busy a lot of the time to be ranting about whether you want to have an MIT license or a copyleft style license.
Yeah, there's definitely a distinction in terms of people who are in the Linux community. So there is really, like you said, the open source enthusiasts, basically, which also in some way contribute to the ecosystem. They look those licenses, they maybe do some reviews if someone makes a mistake. This is a very important part. But on the other hand, you have like all of the technical people who are just looking for something that works, that is stable. So Linux is just a tool for them rather than an active environment. That is especially true like in a business sense, I guess, whereas you have a server and you're not using Linux because it's open source. You don't care what's actually happening in the background. You use Linux because it just works, because it is stable. And those people do exist, and they certainly have a space in the Linux community as well, because big companies obviously want to support their own products. And if a lot of people choose to use Linux because it works better in some way, then it's a good thing to gain those support, even though they don't necessarily like to open source their stuff at first. But I think it's a growing matter, not something that happens just overnight.
Yeah, that I think is definitely the key point. Any change you want to make is going to be, it's going to be a slow, gradual change over time. People will talk about, and this comes up every time that there is a Windows end of support period. Guys, there's going to be so many people that start using Linux, or like when more ads get injected into Windows. Guys, this is the time. Linux, it's finally gonna be the main thing on the desktop. And I get the enthusiasm, right? But it's not like that. It's gonna be small increments every time. And there are absolutely people who stop using Windows because of the TPM stuff that happened, or when Windows 7 left support, or maybe 8 left support, or more ads being injected into Windows. But it's not millions of people, and that's fine, right? It's okay that you make these little dents at a time, because if you look back at, say, I don't know, the start of Debian, the people using Linux back then were a very different crowd from what we see now. Back then, you realistically were going to be a programmer, or at least had some sort of Unix background if you were using Linux. Then at some point Ubuntu came along, and more regular sort of computer users could actually use their system. And I've talked about this before. If I couldn't play games on my system, I would not be a Linux user. And I've had some people try to say that like Steam and Proton, it hasn't been that big of a deal for Linux. And No, it really has been. Like, I don't have 2 computers, and I don't want to dual boot. I probably should set up a capture PC at some point. I know I should do that. But regardless, the fact that you can play games on the same system that you're using Linux on, you can game on your Linux system. For a lot of people, that was the last thing that pushed them over the edge. And then all of these little things that Windows does to make it so slightly worse pushes more people to at least, maybe not swap, but at least try it out and see what it's like. And even though it's only a couple of people at a time, it's a couple of people at a time. And over the years, that adds up. And eventually, you have what we have now, where you have this fairly healthy ecosystem. It could certainly be better, and there are certainly funding issues that exist, and development issues, and bug triaging issues, but I think for the most part, we're in a pretty good state.
Yeah, I think so too, actually. And it's a really interesting discussion on the year of the Linux desktop and when it's finally going to happen. I mean, it will happen in some sense, but it's not like Linux will explode and everyone will just stop using Windows.
Right.
For me, the whole thing is the year of the Linux desktop will come as soon as you have like a sort of sortiment. How would I say it? Let's just put it like you have 50% Windows PCs and 50% Linux PCs in a store. At that point, I could say the Linux desktop is basically here simply because it's mainstream. And I think that's like the main thing is as soon as Linux becomes some sort of mainstream platform, it's the year of the Linux desktop. And in some way, we are already at the start of it because of the Steam Deck, and like people are using Linux even though they don't necessarily even know about it.
Right.
And I'm not talking about embedded systems and all that stuff.
Or like Chrome OS or Android. I guess you'd count those differently.
Yeah, those two are also a different thing. Like Chrome OS is almost a Linux distribution in the sense that we would talk about the Linux distribution. Android is a bit more in a tough spot because there's like so much in it that's different.
Right.
So then there is the whole argument on GNU/Linux and all the other things. But I agree.
Did my Steam start downloading something? No? Your camera just dropped in quality. I don't know whose side that's on. It's fine. I can still hear you fine. It's just you're now like 3 pixels.
Oh yeah, what the hell? 180p. That's fun.
It's fine. Yeah, no, okay. I pretty much agree. I think you summed that up pretty well. I don't think there's really anything else to add to that. Actually, one thing is with Chrome OS. Chrome OS is a very weird one, and you did say it was like almost a Linux distro because you can run Linux software on it, but that's not like the main intention, and it's changing now. Like traditionally with Chrome OS systems, they shipped with very, very minimal storage. Now you are seeing, actual SSDs going into them, and they can store local files. Previously, you were getting 32 gigabyte storage on was sick. Like there basically were phones at that point with the level of storage they had. But even though it may not be the main intention, I do think there is an argument to be made that Linux had become mainstream in a sense because of Chrome OS. In the same way that you can argue that Unix is mainstream because of Mac OS. Even though the way that most people interact with it is very different, at its core, you can still interact with it as if it is a Linux system or a Unix system in the context of macOS.
Yeah. I agree, essentially. So the thing about macOS in particular is it's a Unix system. Yeah, sure. At its core, quite literally. But people are just not using a Unix system, like as in the sense that some would think of it. And I guess that Linux will at some point also go into that direction, just that it is more open source in general,
mm-hmm.
and not being locked down. So you add up a lot of features. A lot of people complain about some stuff, that it gets bloated and all that. But at its core, you don't have to use it in the way that it's being developed. You can always strip out parts. You can always build your own experience. I think that Linux in general is just a better way how a future operating system might look like.
Mm-hmm.
Because you have the modularity if you want it, but at the same time you also have the way how the devs intended, or the big teams. And I find that pretty exciting.
I think the only thing really holding it back from that is there is outside of Gnome, you have a lot of developers designing things. And that's not to take anything away from KDE. KDE's gotten a lot better in this regard. If you go back and look at 3 and 4, very much was developers clearly designing things. But I think right now, Gnome is one of the very few UI polished experiences, and I feel kind of a similar way with Cosmic as I do with KDE. Have you seen much of what is happening on the Cosmic side?
I haven't looked into it except some screenshots, or I think the beta is coming out soon.
Alpha, I believe, is what they're calling it.
Or alpha, yeah. So I know how it's going to look like a bit, and they're doing a pretty good job. But I think that people are in general having they have too much expectation of Cosmic, because if you want, let's call it a unique design choice that spans across the entire desktop environment, then you have problems developing it, and then you are essentially into the whole GNOME policy stuff. Whereas you want to implement it, but you cannot, because it's not in the framework itself yet, or you're not allowed to use it in that way. Yeah, let's see how it plays out.
Yeah, I'm personally excited for it solely because it is a desktop environment that supports tiling. That's my main reason for it, and I know the devs want to. They built PopShell. They want to build a proper tiling desktop environment experience alongside a floating experience, because they know they have the metrics on it that most people are not using the tiling. But a lot of people do, and especially a lot of developers do like that experience. So I'm very curious to see what a desktop environment that has a strong tiling and floating system is actually capable of doing. What I'm curious about is how much they're going to go down the GNOME or the KDE side when it comes to exposing settings, because it looks a lot like GNOME. It's pretty clear that that's a lot of their inspiration. This is what I was getting at before, where I do feel like a lot of the design concepts they have are kind of discount GNOME. It's an alpha, right? Things can improve, and early KDE and early GNOME were not great looking, and I'm sure as we see version 2, version 3, a lot of those issues will be ironed out, and that's understandable. They want to get something out there and then go from there. But I'm curious to see how much they go down this route and what they can learn from the desktops before them, because you can build something completely in a vacuum, and that's cool and all, but I think if you can take what the other environments have done and what you like about them, what you don't like about them, and then make sure you don't replicate those bad behaviors, I think it can get up to speed a lot quicker than a lot of people might expect. I know initially people were talking about Cosmic and were very wary of it, and it's a new desktop environment. How's it going to be anywhere near as good as what we already have? But they're not starting from zero in a sense. Maybe they're starting from zero code, but they're not starting from zero experience with the Linux, with the Linux desktop.
Yeah. So I think the whole thing about the Cosmic development currently is that their baseline is essentially what they had before, and all the additions that maybe Gnome has added up until now. And then, of course, you have KDE Plasma there, which also had a lot of changes. And they are probably going to integrate a lot of these things very quickly. And in the end, I think what Cosmic is going to be is you have like, you certainly see the GNOME experience in some way still, especially like margins and all that stuff and how the menus look in general. But I think you are exposed to much more settings that are tended to please everyone. That includes like variable refresh rate support, fractional scaling. Then, of course, you have maybe setting on some laptops, the mouse pad. On some laptops, you need to set it to area, or that you only can scroll at the side or something. I think like those things will be integrated into the desktop environment itself. So it's basically GNOME is the baseline. Then you have extensions from KDE Plasma and maybe their own additions, which certainly will have an influence on their own desktop PCs, or maybe the other way around, the desktops they build. Whatever is in there will be also available in Cosmic. And I think that's something that other desktop environments cannot achieve that easily, because they just don't know what hardware the user is going to have.
So I presume at this point you're using Wayland completely, yes? Or are you using X11?
Currently, yes, yeah.
Yes, which? Yes, Wayland? Yes, X11.
Wayland.
Okay, yeah. So when did you swap, and what has been like your general experience, and what do you feel like still needs to be addressed for your personal use case? Or do you think everything for what you're doing is just basically fine?
There are some things where I'm not entirely sure who's at fault. Like if it's the protocol or if it's the compositor. Generally speaking, it's mostly it's more of the stuff that I don't use regularly, like something like screencasting. But it's more on the application side rather than Wayland.
Right.
It has come a long way. I think I'm on Wayland exclusively for a year now.
Okay.
So quite a long time. And during this time, the main things were that they dropped the whole forest vsync thing and all that, which made the desktop feel smooth but rather slow when using your mouse and stuff. Like it just felt a bit off. And because I have two monitors which are both 144 hertz but not quite, and I have seen some weird issues where it kind of feels weird when you try to sync them. But it has gotten a lot better, and I think Wayland is almost up to par to X in terms of my overall how I experience my desktops. I haven't seen any more crashes or stuff like that, but it's more the minor things, like screencasting. And drag and drop doesn't work for some reason in KDE Plasma in browsers. I'm not sure if that's a KWin issue, Wayland issue currently or something.
I have noticed things. I've noticed it work, but also I've noticed it just not. It seems very hit and miss for me. Like, I'll drag a file over, it does nothing. I'll drag a file over, it does nothing. Yeah. Then I drag a file over, and it works this time. And I don't know... I don't know if that's, like, what the deal is there. Whether it's... Because I think the browser I'm running is also a Wayland browser as well. So maybe... I don't know. There's definitely some weirdness when it comes to dealing with both X11 and Wayland stuff running at the same time. I've noticed, especially when you're dragging files, I think from XWayland apps into a Wayland app, things might act weirdly. Maybe it's the other way around, Wayland into XWayland. I don't know. It's one of those teething issues that is not broken per se. It's just not as smooth as you would like it.
Yeah, it's not perfect yet. That's
I think that's a good way to put a lot of what we have with Wayland. It's not broken for most things. There are definitely broken things out there, like I think screen readers on Gnome don't work properly. On KDE, they have a workaround for it. And if you need a screen reader, like, you simply need a screen reader. But most things are just, it's kind of a little weird. And you can get used to it. But I do think we're still a good couple of years away from it being completely up to X11. There are certain things like I'll have people talk to me about, like, network transparency. Like, okay, that's great, but like, how many people? If you're using remote desktops, you're using VNC now. You're not doing X11 network transparency. If you are, you're a very, very tiny group of people, and that's great that you need that feature, but it's not something that most people are going to be bothered by. Like, most people are going to be bothered by like, having apps like OBS have their hotkeys work properly. Obviously, OBS is a very special app, but the same problem exists with screen readers for those people. Or there's a lot of people that like nightlight apps, for example. And for a long time, Gnome and KDE didn't have Wayland nightlight apps. Now they do. And it's more of those problems that I think as more people try out Wayland, it's not the things... Some people think we're not making progress. It's just, as more people try out Wayland, more of these issues are being noticed. No one initially thought that screen tearing, for example, was a feature that anybody would want. Wayland's about perfect frames, and it took 3 years to convince the developers that this is a feature that people actually want. If you go read the thread, the first comment on the thread about... This is a really funny one. The first comment on the thread about screen tearing, the guy who first complains, like, no one ever wants this, is the guy who ended up merging the merge 3 years later. So it took him a while to be, like, convinced about it, but, like, that's the problem. We can't ignore these problems that exist on Wayland, even though there's not as many key ones that there was before. Getting involved in those discussions and actually trying to resolve them, I think, at bare minimum, that's what I think a lot of people need to do. And I know some people just don't want to get involved in repos, and that's fine, but at some point, these problems, someone needs to actually bring them up if you think it's actually a problem.
Yeah, I think that one of the problems that Wayland and also Gnome suffer from is some sort of, they want to do things properly and secure.
Yes.
Which is something that slows development down a lot, and they don't want to implement more than needs to have. And on the other hand, I mean, some things are really justified. Like, why do we work with X portals or is it X portals or with portals in general on Wayland? And why do we need to use Pipewire to screencast and stuff like that? Those are valid things, but it just slows down development, and stuff needs to be implemented later. People need to be convinced. It just takes a long time, and we are in a transition from X to Wayland. A lot of stuff just doesn't work yet. A lot of stuff just isn't implemented yet, and many developers need to rewrite their apps as a whole in some cases if they truly want to have a Wayland native experience. Yeah, it's a lot of work in progress. But once Wayland offers basically most things, and we have a transition to Wayland in terms of application support, I think the experience will be much better then.
I do think some of the arguments are kind of ridiculous, though. My favorite, my favorite thread, I've brought this up so many times, is the thread about window icons. It's like 400 comments long about how to implement window icons. It's really dumb, and they're getting somewhere. But I think Wayland is the textbook definition of design by committee and having too many cooks in the kitchen. Like, because, you know, there's no BDFL in Wayland. You have GNOME, KDE, Cosmic, Western, WL Roots all have equal voting rights on whether something gets implemented. And that's fine when everybody agrees on the rare occasions when they do. But there are a lot of cases where GNOME especially doesn't want to do something, or they have their way they want to implement it, and things get stalled because of it. It's not always GNOME. Sometimes KDE has problems as well. Sometimes Western has problems. But when you don't have a project leader, this is what you get. This is why design by committee is always discussed as this like really dangerous idea of like how to run a project, because it's going to take a long time to get things done. And that might be fine, right? Like, we aren't... The clock has been set for Wayland, but if everybody had to swap to Wayland tomorrow, besides the accessibility stuff, which is a legitimate issue, and those people actually couldn't use their computer, besides that, most people would be fine. Maybe they wouldn't be happy. They wouldn't be happy. But
it depends, I guess.
Most like things that people are using to work just fine, I would say.
On the desktop, I would agree. I think we would start to see a lot of I mean, a lot of people are coming from a technical perspective and are often working with Linux on servers as well.
Yeah.
I think that turning off X would be a huge problem for those people in particular. Because I know that a lot of applications rely on X to work, and also some stuff like RDP applications, you still use X and only work on X. And if that's implemented in some weird custom way, like the application is built for that protocol and that solution, then we are running into certain issues. And I know that some stuff doesn't work. For the desktop, I would agree, but there are a lot of stallers on the server side as well.
Okay, that's
which
fair.
Use some desktop experiences there as well, some app streaming and stuff like that.
No, that's fair. Like, I don't think it should be done, right? You know, it's got like the timeline we have set right now. The deadline we have set basically is the death of Rel 7, because when Rel 7's dead, that means Red Hat is going to stop maintaining Xorg completely, because they have no reason to keep maintaining it. And that means basically nobody's maintaining Xorg. And it'll be fine for a bit, I guess. Do you have like a thing you've been refilling there? Because I've noticed you drinking that. I don't think you... Yeah, no, do you have like a...
I got a whole thing.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Cool. I thought I was going insane, because I kept seeing you drink, and I didn't see the level go down. Okay, that makes sense now. But where was I going with that before I got sidetracked by magical tea? Oh, right. Rel 7. We have a deadline set. They actually did extend the deadline for Rel 7 by another 4 years. I think it's like 2036 or something now. So it's a bit more time. But I hope by then... I hope it's not going to be one of these issues where people don't start taking it seriously until we're very close to the deadline. Because I know there's been a lot of projects, especially as of late, who are like, yeah, well, we're just going to drop Wayland support and just not even think about it. We're just going to go full XWayland, and it's going to work fine. Like, there's no plans to drop XWayland for the foreseeable future. But I don't know if relying on that until the end of time is a good idea, because there probably will come a time where there is discussions to drop XWayland.
Yeah, definitely. And part of the reason is, of course, because people are going to rely on XWayland for stuff to work. Especially gaming currently.
That one is being worked on.
Luckily.
The Wine devs they have, I guess you would call it like rudimentary Wayland support. It's like a 30-part patch set series. There is so much work to go into doing this, but
I find this pretty noble. But on the other hand, I guess a lot of people are developing apps because, or they don't care to use X because there is XWayland and it will be there for the near foreseeable future. So why bother with Wayland and learning all how you need to talk to each protocol individually when you just could use X essentially and it will work anyway.
Luckily, Toolkits do alleviate a lot of that problem. Like if you're using Qt, you don't really need to think about it being Wayland for the most part because it does abstract a lot of that out for you. But if you're using some of the more like simple toolkits, sometimes it's not as kind towards you.
Qt is pretty good actually, I think.
I haven't used it in a while. I learned it back when I was first learning C++, but I never stuck with it. I probably should go back to it and mess around with it properly at some point. But because I keep hearing that GTK is not pleasant to write code for. So maybe I probably I'll avoid that one. Maybe.
I think it depends. So when you just write a simple application, like a simple user UI, it's actually pretty simple. I'm not sure what the programming language was. I think it's the most common ones. I think you can write in Python and all that stuff. It's not really that hard. Like you don't necessarily need to use C or C++. On the other hand, you can go when you go a bit deeper, then you definitely need to learn it in some way.
Yeah, for sure. I know the people doing stuff with Vala. I know there's that. I am not big on the GTK development. I just hear stuff from the outside about what people have said about it. I've never really been big on the desktop app development. When I do a lot of development, most of my stuff is like website stuff and obviously like system scripts and things like that. I've never really done a proper deep dive into doing like desktop level applications. I should. It's on my very long list of things that I should get around to learning. The infinitely long list of things. Especially if you want to keep up with anything that's actually going on. Especially like web development, right? Do you have any experience with like web stuff?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, because the point I was gonna make there is like I learned like I've done some React work in the past and like that was fine at the time. Apparently now everyone hates React and I don't know what people are using now. And you can like if you actually want to keep up with what's happening on the web, things move so quickly. But then you realize things move quickly amongst the people who care about talking about it. But then you go get a job and you realize they're still using jQuery from 10 years ago. Like they haven't even updated. Yeah. They're just still using a 10-year-old version of jQuery. And it's easy to get caught up in learning the newest, coolest thing and like lose track of focusing on the core concepts. But I think focusing more on the ideas that you want to learn rather than the specific tech is going to get you a lot further.
Yeah, definitely. Like always chasing the newest and recent stuff is generally not a really good practice because I mean I'm pretty comfortable here on Fedora, but there are distros that are even more bleeding edge than Arch.
Arch isn't really bleeding edge. It's just
it's rolling, but it's not
rolling,
that bleeding edge as many perceive it to be. There are many distros that are actually like there is a release. It's basically version 1.2.0, whatever, and next day it's up there in some repo because someone recompiled it already. And it's not really a good practice to chase that experience because like stuff will break. But on the other hand, it's a really good idea to inform yourself about what's happening on the web, because then you run into some issues. Whereas, like you said, some company has very old tools, which they at some point so rely on that if there is some security issue, then they just can't patch it that easily because it's like so deeply integrated into the system. Yeah, it's a good idea to update from time to time and like not really chase the newest, but like find a good middle ground.
Right, right. You don't need to be running a 40-year-old COBOL mainframe.
Yeah.
If you want the most stable possible job, simply because there's so few people that know it, become an expert level COBOL or Fortran developer, because there's so few people competing for those jobs, and a lot of those people are close to retirement. It's going to be hard to get one of those jobs, but the second you get it, they will never get rid of you because nobody else knows how to touch that arcane code. And they're not going to find some like junior dev they can train up for it. Nobody's going to want to learn it. So it's gonna be you. Never let them convince you though that it's a good idea to update the system into something like C#, because the second that you rewrite it into something sensible, they don't need you anymore, because now they can hire someone who's not a COBOL developer.
Exactly. I hate old stuff. It's insane. Like updating a system, like it doesn't matter if it's Windows or a Linux. Updating an old system and do like major version jumps over years. That's actually insane. I know of a server which I tried migrating a bunch of times. It's Windows Server 2008, which is fairly old at this point, and like you just can't update it. You cannot make a new server and put the program on it, because the program depends on a lot of stuff that needs to be carried over. I think it's licensing stuff and all that, because there is no licensing server anymore and all that.
Right.
So you need to do an in-place upgrade, but the in-place upgrade doesn't work because of some dependencies, and it's stupid.
Well, especially with these like really old systems where you don't have redundancy built in place, there's always the worry of it, especially like if you have a system that hasn't been shut down in a long time, like is it going to turn back on?
Yeah.
Like I've definitely heard horror stories of there was a server that people were running in this company. No one really knew like why it was running or who set it up, but they realized very quickly as soon as it caused a problem that they didn't have a redundancy solution in place 10 years ago. And it turns out that was like a core part of their system that just it's gone now. Good luck.
Yeah, that's not a good practice.
Oh, look, I'm really bad with like redundancy on my system, but like if you have something in production, whether it's like it doesn't matter what it is, you probably should have at least some basic redundancy, some like bare minimum like data backups. Preferably recent data backups as well. It's all well and good to have a data backup, but if you haven't updated it in 5 years, it's not that useful for backup.
Backups are so incredibly important. Like it doesn't really matter for which system. Like of course for business or server side, it's really important. But on your home PC, you don't really think about it much. But then something breaks, and you're like, oh, there were some important documents on there, or maybe there were some pictures on it that you would like to have. I've lost a bunch of SD cards, of all the SD cards with a lot of memories, or the SD cards break, which also happens. I've had servers crashes. I had a Windows system of mine completely hard reset. I have no idea what happened there. After an update, it just never came back. And there was no way of getting the data off the drive. Just completely. And like stuff like that makes you realize you need backups.
Yeah.
It's incredibly important, and it happened so many times already. I think it 7 times already that my PC corrupted in some way. or so some PC corrupted. Yeah.
Well, I still don't have great backups, and I really should, because this has bitten me like recently, where to be fair, it was my fault. I had this issue where every so often I booted my system, I would get a systemd error message, and it would be like, something couldn't mount your home, and I would need to like run a command, it would fix it, and that was fine. It was fine for like 6 months. Then at one point, I opened it, and a bunch of random files were just missing. I think I lost 2 podcasts. So I lost like 4 hours of recordings. I lost maybe like 3 videos that I hadn't uploaded yet, and a bunch of other random things. Don't do that. Do as I say, not as I do. Have data backups. I'm bad at it. Do not be like me. Even if it's not a NAS, like, just have something. Have a second drive that you mirror directly to. It doesn't have to be a complicated setup.
Mm.
And getting it like another drive isn't really that expensive now. Like, the drives are pretty cheap.
Yeah. I think a lot of people also don't use their second, or a lot of mainboards have a second M.2 slot. A lot of people just don't use it. I mean, if you put in a very cheap one and do like even a hardware RAID, which basically every modern mainboard supports, like you just mirror that stuff, and it will automatically tell you when you boot up your PC that one drive is broken, then you can exchange it, but you can still use your PC. Even though mirroring is technically no backup, but that's its whole other issue.
Yeah, like people, I guess I get people say, oh, well, you shouldn't have a mirror in your system. You should have that in like a external machine. Like, what's the general guidance? It's local. It's like a local copy, a cloud copy, and there's something else. Like, there's a general guideline people have for like a proper data backup, because if you break your machine, you might, even if you have like a secondary drive, you might break the other drive as well. So you should have another drive and another machine, and then you should have an offsite copy as well.
Yeah, or at least some external media that doesn't rely on some form of electricity, battery, or whatever.
Yeah.
That's like the overall suggestion. And I mean, it's kind of true, because like, if for some reason, or let's just say your house or whatever is hit with a lightning strike, and for some reason it manages to fry your PC, if you had a mirrored setup or you had a second hard drive in it, and both are gone, then yeah. It's not all that great. On the other hand, if you have like a USB stick, which you also like back up once a month or something, or like an external hard drive, that is safe as long as it's not connected to the system. It's a good practice, but I also don't really do it, so it should be something to think about.
Well, then there's the whole idea of having something offsite as well, whether that's like cloud storage or whatever it is. Because, if your house floods, you could lose both the mirror and also the USB.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that would be... that depends.
I guess it depends on like the environment you're in. Like, in somewhere like Australia, like in South Australia, we don't really have any natural disasters here. Like, when there's the last time there was an earthquake, they had like a big news story about it, and an earthquake in South Australia is somebody's window cracks. That's pretty much it. Like, it'll maybe like a brick will slightly move out of place. We don't really get earthquakes here. The worst we get here are bushfires. And they can get pretty bad. But in like where I am, like, it's besides like a house fire, which is gonna happen anywhere. Like, you don't really get general natural disasters here. Like, it's pretty safe where I am. If I was in like Queensland, they get like hurricanes up there, they get floods up there. We don't really get earthquakes here though, because fault lines and all that. But if you are somewhere that gets earthquakes, yeah, I guess maybe offsite backup is probably a better idea as well.
Yeah.
But Do something. do something. Something is better than nothing.
Yeah, at least one copy is always good. Doesn't really matter how old it is. It should have some sort of content on it. Like I usually keep one backup around, which like my PC is pretty simple. I actually don't save anything on my PC basically, except maybe some recent downloads, some ISO files or something. And I do have a picture folder or directory, so all that basic stuff, which I copy once over, and if I do some changes, then I copy them once a month or whatever to another system. But I actually don't really do that. So I essentially have one backup that's over a year old, which is exactly the system in the way it was before when it comes in terms of files and like the important stuff.
Right. I guess it also depends on like how much you're adding files depending on what you want to do, right? Like a lot of things you have, if it's like, tax documents from however long your country requires you to have history for, or anything else like that. A lot of things you have, they don't need to be up-to-date copies because it's not something that is changing. But if it is something like, I don't know, video stuff, for example, like a video that you're working on, then you might change how you want to handle that data backup. Whether you want to do like especially with something like a video, right? Like maybe a mirror is fine for that because the life cycle of that video is going to be a lot less than something like memories you want to keep. You might, I don't know how often you upload, but like if you record something, if you record something like the video, yeah, you can argue like, you want to keep things around. Like you could have like a petabyte server like LTT has, but most people when they're doing videos are not keeping their old content around. So it doesn't really need to live that long.
Yeah, I think it also depends on how serious you are into backups, if you have any requirements in terms of legal requirements. Like, I'm not sure if that's actually true or not, because like a lot of stuff is written, but I technically would need to keep all of my videos, I think, for 6 months or something, just in case something happens. I'm not sure if that applies to YouTube or not. It's a bit weird. But there are also some documents that I have digitally saved that I would have to keep for a long time. So I do need to keep backups just in case, even though most likely nothing would happen if there actually was a data loss. I mean, who's going to come to my house? Do you have that document? Yeah, sure. No, whatever. Nah, no one's going to come anyway.
I don't know how we got to data backups. See, this is what I was saying like before we started recording. Sometimes we get on a tangent and we'll talk about nothing for like 20 minutes.
It's kind of weird.
Yeah, but it's fine.
We could switch it up.
Well, I guess we talk about a bit about your channel. So when you first started, you were doing like more of the, how would you describe it? Like the how to be a YouTuber sort of videos. Like you're doing videos on like OBS plugins on, like you literally had a video called why you should stream on YouTube in 2022.
Yeah.
What made you want to swap from doing that sort of stuff over to doing the Linux stuff you do now?
Just the story is quite simple. So I have been making a lot of those older videos, especially towards streamers, and I did do some mouse reviews. Some I did in German, some I did in English, on a different channel. I've been trying this for years, but it never found the right audience because there's just a lot of competition and all that. And as soon as I started getting into Linux, I was like, yeah, sure, I'll make a video on it. And there were a lot of people interested into the stuff I discovered and some perspectives. And then I thought to myself, there's generally not a lot of content around. And the stuff that I, at the time, found personally was more towards professional use, like how to use that command, how to use this command.
Yeah.
And I was like, but no one is really making a lot of stuff on desktop environments and on all that. And that's how I basically determined for myself that I was going to create content on Linux or exclusively almost desktop Linux. And that it's actually not that hard to use it unless you need some specialized case.
Right. Yeah. No, that's in a way, like how I felt about it initially as well. Mine was also, there were some people at the time where I didn't like the way they did the videos, and I was like, I can do that better. Turns out I couldn't, and the videos I made back then were really bad, but there was the idea I had in my head, and that was what spurred me on to start doing it. And now honestly, I just enjoy digging into some of these topics. Like, I think I'm one of the very few people that will do a video on like something happening in like a mailing list somewhere. And, maybe you'll see like a Phronix article on it, and there'll be like a little excerpt. But I will go through every comment on there, and I will find out what the hell is going on in that thread. And I've never understood it. But for some reason, there is a relatively sizable audience that is interested in what is going on in these projects. And maybe it's because they are using them and they're like, okay, well, here's the thing that I have, and it works relatively well. But I want to know, like, how do we go from, this... How do we go from the state it was in before to the state it's in now? Like, what really happened there behind the scenes? Because a lot of projects really... They're good at saying, like, what they've done, but many of them aren't great at communicating, like, how it was done or why it was done. And usually that discussion it's somewhere there in the mailing list or somewhere there in the merge request. And I guess, I don't know, it's fun to go dig into it and see, like, why and, like, what really is going on there. Especially in, like, the Wayland case, for example. Like, you'll see a protocol being added, like screen tearing. And then you realize, oh, this is insane. How did it take this long?
There's a bunch of... which request was it? There's also one in Gnome. I think it's over 10 years old. What was it about? I can't remember. It was a very old merge request, and it hasn't been resolved. And there's still active discussion going on how to implement this certain feature. I'm not sure which one was. I thought it was the icons, the icon picker, which was also a long time.
Yes.
But there is another one, which was like from the Gnome 3.2 era. I'm not entirely sure when the switch was. It's very old.
If you knew what it was, I probably would recognize it, but it's not coming to mind what it would be.
The point is, it's really interesting to read through the backs and forths and why something is not implemented. And at some point, it's also interesting because there are some that are very impatient, and then they're just going to blame someone or like basically trying to fight the community, like why is this not implemented? This isn't so hard or whatever. It's really fun to read, though. Those people most don't last very long anyway.
Yeah, I guess the idea is just find... Well, this is... Maybe this is what it is. Maybe it's just that because I'm enjoying what I'm going through, people are enjoying watching me enjoy it. Maybe, I don't know, maybe that's part of it. Like, enjoy the content you're making and you'll find an audience of people that enjoy it.
Yeah.
I guess maybe, you might have people who watch your Gnome stuff who are like, I guess, hate watching it, who are KDE users, trying to like, ooh, let's see what's so bad about Gnome. I don't know. Maybe I'm just cynical. Maybe I'm sure there's some people going into it with an open mind and just trying to like see what's happening on the other side. But I'm sure there's a lot of people who are just watching it just to see what they don't like about the desktop they already know they don't like.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are just looking for something to agree or to disagree on.
That's
not just
very
to
true.
To learn something new. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like it's incredible. Like every versus video, every GNOME versus KDE Plasma video or something, like I switch to this desktop environment or this desktop environment.
Mm-hmm.
Statistically speaking, it does get more views than the average, and you already know that a lot of people are just not there because they want to see the reasoning behind it, but they're just looking for the facts, basically, which they can disagree or agree.
Yeah. Yeah. You go into a video with like, if you're going into a video about why KDE sucks or why GNOME is incredible, like, and you're already using that system, like, you're not, like, you're just looking for something to boost up your own ego at that point. And that's fine, right? But, like, let's not pretend that it's anything else.
Yeah.
But
that's interesting, yeah.
On the flip side of that, like, if you make a video where you are against the general sentiment, you will notice there are definitely some people out there that really struggle to, I guess, understand the perspective that someone else is coming from. And this is something that I've definitely dealt with, like personally, not understanding someone else's perspective, and it's something I've definitely gotten better at. But I do definitely see that there are some people. This is especially true if you start looking into like any contentious Linux issue, whether it be, it's not even really contentious amongst normal people, but like systemd. If you talk about like Wayland or X11, if you talk about GNOME or KDE, if you're not in line with like the general sentiment, you will definitely hear from people about it. Or especially if it's like, I think the smaller the thing is, but how would I say it? The smaller the thing is, the more likely people are going to argue if you disagree with the sentiment. Like, if you're talking about Linux in general, I guess because there are so many people with so many different opinions, like, the people who are really angry with what you're saying aren't going to be, like, the main focus. But if you're talking about something smaller, like, you're specifically talking about a KDE issue that people disagree with you on, you're going to notice that it seems like a lot more people disagree, whereas it's not necessarily that more people do, it's the proportion because there's just simply less people interested in that topic.
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially just cherry picking them out of the crowd and making them vocal. So that's definitely something that you notice. A lot of posts when there's something negative, you look into the comments or something, and there is a bunch of people that disagree with this, but you don't really find something similar if you just look it up online or something. You have to specifically look for it, and then you of course find the complaints and all that. But there's also another thing where a lot of people just get influenced by others in terms of decision making. What I found always funny, even though I certainly don't like it either, is the whole Nvidia topic. Nvidia proprietary, all that stuff. Some stuff didn't work. But then there's also the whole biased approach where a lot of stuff just works nowadays, but it's still presumed as it doesn't work.
Yes.
Or that issues that are in a completely a different thing are biased towards Nvidia. I've seen many Wayland issues where, as the issue was the Wayland protocol itself, but it was always no, that's an Nvidia issue, even though same stuff happened on AMD and on Intel. It's very interesting.
Yeah, I've talked about this in previous episodes as well, where a lot of people, they form an opinion on it once and then never look into whether something has changed. And this is especially true with Nvidia stuff. Like, people talk about in the state of Nvidia on Wayland being like it was 5 years ago, or they'll talk about, my favorite one is when people bring up things like screen capturing on Wayland. I still see people today who think you cannot screen capture on Wayland. you can. You've been able to for a long time, or just various other, like, I think this goes back to when I was saying that projects are good at talking about what they do. Sometimes they're not even good at that. Like, it's very difficult sometimes to find out what the state of something is unless you're actively using it yourself. Like, you might not know how Nvidia GPUs work on Wayland because you just don't have one, and especially in that case, that's not an easy thing to go and try out. It's easy to go and try out Gnome or KDE, but if you want to know what Nvidia GPUs like that's an expensive endeavor to like find out an answer for, and most people are not willing to do that, and most people, I would hope, would at least go and try to find like recent forum posts about it. But even then, there are definitely people who just they read something at one point, and that's just the way it works now until the end of time.
Yeah, and I think in generally speaking, a lot of hate towards those proprietary things or like stuff that's really hated. I think it goes both ways in many things. Like, I now have an AMD GPU. It works essentially the same way as Nvidia can, but I do have a worse experience while video editing because like a lot of stuff doesn't work on AMD, and many are forgetting that AMD could open source a bunch more stuff, could help to improve their ROCm libraries and all that stuff. They could do that. They could work together with Blackmagic, the original developer, and all that. But they're not doing that. So it's not just black and white. Like Nvidia is messing up a lot of stuff, but they're also doing or providing a lot of solid stuff that others could use. There are good and bad things about both companies. In the end, Nvidia is a lot more hostile towards the Linux desktop, but it does have a place, and especially like in huge data farms and stuff like that, I think it's probably exclusively Nvidia there.
Yeah, AMD's kind of dropped the ball. Like, Nvidia is not a GPU company. Nvidia is an AI shovel company. They are selling. Every time that people get more excited about AI, Nvidia's stock price goes up. Because if you're doing AI, you're Nvidia. Like, there's just no question about it. There is a little use case in like scientific research for AMD, but for the most part, it's Nvidia. And like, I would like to have an Nvidia card for, CUDA. CUDA is just useful. And Nvidia's video encoder is just better. But there's the rest of it. It's the rest of it. And things are getting very close to being good with Nvidia. Like, they've dealt with explicit sync is being dealt with. You've got the whole NVK and all that being dealt with. And like, that's awesome. And I think we're going to get to a point where there is legitimately not going to be an argument to not buy an Nvidia GPU besides not liking the proprietary drivers. And that's totally fair if that's the reason why you don't want to support it. But even then, like, we're going to get to a point where the open drivers are going to be pretty good. So, yeah. And I know people say, like, oh, well, why don't you just buy an AMD GPU if you're going to use Linux? And that's fine if you're buying hardware specifically for your system, but going back to the new users are going to use what they have. Like, you used like an old laptop you had, what was the device you had?
The old thing that was an Acer thing. I think it has I actually have it still. It has an Intel onboard GPU, but also a dedicated AMD 78M, 780M or something. It's a very, very weird system, but it worked generally fine. But then I also have other things, like I have a Microsoft Surface. I put Linux on it. Yeah, it has an Intel GPU, which should work with Mesa and everything, but that's not the whole story. Like, cameras don't work, all that stuff. And those are the devices that people usually use. Like, they have a device, they want to put Linux on it. And if it's not a desktop PC, which generally works pretty well, but if it's a mobile device, a laptop with a lot of hardware in it, like you have the cameras, you have the microphones, the speakers, and all that stuff, you don't really have a good time.
Yeah. Which is sad, but hey, it is what it is.
Yeah, exactly.
We're coming up on the 2-hour mark now, so I guess we probably should start wrapping it up. This has been fun. I enjoyed this.
Yeah, me too. It's an interesting experience. I'm really bad at this sort of talks.
I've had people a lot worse on than you, so it's fine. You're used to talking on camera. That's a step above a lot of people. There are some people I've had on where they don't know how to like talk. They just I'll ask a question and they'll say 3 words about it, and that's pretty much it. And it's a struggle to get through the episode, but you know, I feel like you did a fine job.
All right.
Well, let people know where they can find your stuff, wherever you want to direct them to.
Okay. Yeah, I have a YouTube channel, youtube.com/@MichaelHornNROH, which is basically my last name spelled backwards.
I didn't even notice that. That makes sense.
And I also have a Twitter account. I'm also on Mastodon, even though I rarely post something, but it's hopefully going to improve soon. And that's essentially it.
Awesome. Nothing else you want to mention? That's it.
No
video.
Nothing real.
Actually, by the time this comes out, you'll probably have like 2 videos out by then. I was gonna say tease a new video, but I have a giant backlog of podcasts.
Yeah. I don't really have much to say except for thanks for the invitation.
Absolute pleasure.
I had a blast talking to you. And even though due to our different time zones, I was happy that we could find a time that works for both of us.
Yeah, I'm happy that I'm not recording this at a stupid time. For anyone who's curious, it is currently 6:30 p.m. for me. It is not 6 a.m. for me, like some of the episodes I do, or... I was not joking. I have actually recorded podcasts, especially with a lot of Europeans. Like, they were like, hey, let's record at 7 p.m. my time. I'm like, okay, what does that work out to? I'm plus 9:30. So, I see. Okay, well, do I sleep or do I stay up? But this is nice. I appreciate it. Yeah. As for me, my main channel is Brody Robertson. I do Linux videos there 6 days a week. Yeah, something like that. Yeah, no, it is 6 days a week. The gaming channel is Brody on Games. Right now, I probably am streaming Sekiro. I haven't decided yet, but you'll see when you go there. And whatever the other game is, I don't know. Check it out. If you're listening to the audio version of this, you can find the video version on YouTube at Tech Over Tea. If you're watching the video and want to find the audio, there is an RSS feed. It'll be on all of your favorite podcast apps. Yeah, give me the final word. What do you want to say?
I like free time.
On the spot. See you guys later.